Welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm Patrick, the CEO of Sano Genetics, and I'm very excited to be here in person with Jillian Hastings Ward. I love doing podcasts in person because when we record them remotely, the sound quality can be a little strange, and also it's just not the same as a conversation. But besides that, I think Jillian is going to be an incredible guest. She has an amazing perspective on what it means to have patients involved in research, from both her career now as if it's fair to say that, as a patient advocate, and also her experience as a mother of a child with a rare disease. So very excited to be here with you, Jillian.
Thanks very much, Patrick.
So today we're going to talk a lot about what it actually means to do patient-powered research and what I think what the future will look like. And Jillian has done something that no podcast guest has ever done before, which is send almost a kind of manifesto of her vision of the future of patient-powered research. And I think it's brilliant because few people actually think about it in such a structured and visionary way. So I wondered if you could just maybe start by going back to how you got involved in this in the first place, and then maybe we can talk about some of your ideas for the future.
Sure, thanks very much. I think it's fair to say that, like many people who've become patient advocates, none of us really planned this from the beginning. It just happened by virtue of having a child who turned out to be quite severely disabled and discovering that nobody else really knew what was wrong with him either.
Right. We had Matt Might on the podcast before, almost I think it was 2-3 weeks ago, and he had the very same, essentially kind of lightning strike that changed his career. So that was it for you. What precisely happened?
Well, I'd been working in the civil service here in London, and my son was my second child, who was born nearly 6 years ago now. And it became apparent at about 3 months of age that he wasn't seeing anything. And subsequently we discovered that actually that wasn't his only problem, and his developmental levels were quite a long way behind what you would expect. And as time has gone by, he's continued to diverge from the norm. He's still operating at the level of a 6-month-old, really. But he's very loved and he enjoys the life that he has. Yeah. And now, thanks to the wonderful genetic medicine in this country and the ability of, thanks to the 100,000 Genomes Project, the ability to find out specifically which gene is causing his trouble, we've been able to find a community of people around the world who are in the same position and start doing something about it.
So we'll go into this a little bit more later, but recently you've won an award from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative as part of the patient foundation that you've helped start and been a part of. Can we just go back to the diagnosis of your son in the first place? How long did it take to go from kind of initial, when you spotted that there was a problem, and just walk us through exactly how that went for you?
Gosh. Well, it seemed to take quite a number of years, actually, until we got to a diagnosis. But 3 months, we were referred to an ophthalmologist who said, it's probably just a visual delay.
Right.
Come back in 9 months if you're still having trouble. But
nine months,
yeah. Yeah, just go home and right. Flash some lights at him and everything will be fine, And you want to believe that, don't you?
Yeah.
And the reason that diagnosis was made at the time was because there's not anything structurally wrong with his eyes.
Right.
So as far as the ophthalmologist could tell, all the bits were working as they should.
Right.
And it just wasn't until later we discovered that the messages coming in from his eyes aren't being interpreted as they should be.
Right. That makes sense. And so at some point you were referred to a clinical geneticist. It didn't take 9 months, hopefully. Was it?
No, that process, we saw a paediatrician next,
right.
And she tested his various functions just before his first birthday and concluded that there was quite a lot was quite wrong.
Right.
And did the tests that were available to her at the time. She tested his blood for the white cell count, right. And various other bits and pieces at the time as well. And all of those results came back normal, but he clearly wasn't. So right. The next thing to do was to refer on to genetics.
Right.
And they invited us to join the 100,000 Genomes Project.
Right. So you're actually now a leader in the 100,000 Genomes Project. At the time you joined, do you know what number patient or family you were?
That's a good question. We were recruited in South London. At the time we were living here, although we've subsequently moved away, and St George's Hospital recruited us, and I think we were one of the first families that they got. So they were quite interested to follow our progress.
Yes.
But it also meant that we were sort of guinea pigs. So our samples were sent off, and we were invited to join the patient network that existed then, in the sense that we could get emails with updates on how the project was going in the round rather than our specific results. And so about 6 months after that, that would be the autumn of 2015, that we signed up and gave our blood. And about the following spring, there was an email came round through the local Genomic Medicine Centre saying that Genomics England were setting up a participant panel and looking for people who'd be interested to join it. And if they had relevant skills and interest, then you had to have been sampled or about to be sampled as part of the project in order to qualify, or to be the main carer of someone who had. So you had to have skin in the game, as it's described.
Absolutely.
And really to have that first-hand experience. Because what Genomics England wanted to do was really tap into the users that were actually experiencing life as people who had rare conditions, and in due course some of whom have rare cancers and not so rare cancers. To make sure that they were hearing directly from people who were using the system to find out how it was going. So I was fortunate to join the panel, and about a year after that, I would say, we did a bit of a secret shopper test to find out how our research or how our samples were all going through the process. So those of us who by then had been recruited from all over the country went back to our recruiting centres and said, so, how's it going? What happened to my sample? Can you tell me where I am in the system? And that was fascinating at that point, because understandably, the initial focus was on recruitment, getting people in, building the pipelines that then they could process the data and get answers out at the end. So there was quite a variety of experience across the country, and thanks to that prodding, I think it then turned out that there had been a result had come back to my local geneticist where they'd found a variant that they thought was pathogenic, and then we were able to hear about that once it had been verified by the local centre.
Wow, but it did potentially take some of that kind of action from you to move it along. I mean, I suppose that we talk about this a lot on the podcast around how most research projects actually get patients involved way too late in the game, because things like this haven't been thought about, right? As you say, the focus is on recruitment, and perhaps rightfully so at the beginning, but the follow through isn't always there.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and I wouldn't say it was anything to, I don't feel like by being part of the panel we managed to get special treatment. It was just that we were essentially stress testing the system for them and discovered a few things on the way. Well,
it's like almost like with any product that if you reach out to the company with a problem, they will help you to solve it, right? But you do have to take that action and say, where is my Amazon? Where is my package? They don't always respond.
Yeah. Having said that, though, that was one of the great things that came out of this. It was we demonstrated that there was a huge appetite among patients and participants in this project to find out where they were in the system, and that it wasn't quite as straightforward as everyone had thought it would be to tell people where they were in the queue, as it were. So Genomics England were persuaded to set up a sample tracking service, which enabled any participant anywhere in the country to contact them and find out where they were.
And I think it also should be said that, as far as I know, Genomics England is certainly the largest sequencing program or organization of this kind to have a patient, to have a participant or patient panel to give this feedback. So that do you see that as is it a exemplar for other projects? Do you see this in other projects around the world?
That's a good question.
Should it be?
I think we've established that there are great benefits to engaging with your end users and the people they love. And I think the model that we've developed in the course of getting as far as we have with the 100,000 Genomes Project, which isn't finished yet, but it's doing a good job for a lot of people. Those sort of relationships are now something that we're trying to encourage other organisations to think about putting in their own governance structures.
So, and maybe this is an interesting segue to the work that you're doing that's being funded by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, because that initiative, from my understanding, is, at least as of today, very focused on funding patient-led organizations and patient-led initiatives. So in some ways, it's maybe flipping the model rather than saying we have a national program or a scientist-led program that then gets patients involved at the early stages, you can flip it around and say, let's start. And a lot of the balance of power is because who has the money, right, and who can dictate the terms of what happens. So is that, can you tell us a little bit more about what the plans are with that and what you intend to do?
Okay, sure. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative last summer announced that they were going to bring out a program called Rare as One.
Right.
And the intention is to support patient-led research organisations to share skills between each other, but also to be able to develop networks that are of scientists and clinicians around the world who will be able to help provide their expertise to that group of families who are affected by a specific rare condition,
right,
with the intention of finding treatments and ultimately a cure.
So what are the big challenges in GRIN disorders? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that for people who haven't heard of GRIN.
Sure, yes. Yeah, we've missed out a few steps on the story of how my son was diagnosed, but it turned out he was the first person diagnosed in the NHS with a disorder in the GRIN1 gene.
Right.
And there are several different GRIN genes. We've now discovered that there are pathogenic variants in GRIN1, GRIN2A, 2B and 2D. And so there are patient groups around the world in each of those different GRIN groups. And
do people who are affected by one resemble closely the others, or there's some overlaps, but not fully, I imagine?
There are quite a lot of similarities. They're all fundamental to how your NMDA receptors work in your brain. So difficulties tend to focus on intellectual disability and movement disorders, epilepsies. GRIN1 particularly seems to be affected by vision disorders.
Right.
GRIN2, some of the GRIN2 genes have more of a correlation with autism, right, for example. So there's different themes among the different genes, but the scientists that we've been speaking to most often, Professor Steve Train-Ellis and his team at Atlanta, Emory University in Atlanta, they've been trying to encourage us for a number of years now to coalesce around the wider GRIN.
Right. So rather than each gene with its own group. Yeah.
Yes. In the basis that the things that tend to go wrong with one could also be going wrong with another.
Right.
And if they can find ways to address what happens in some of the GRIN genes, then perhaps there'll be lessons that are transferable. And also it gives them a larger population of people to study.
Right.
So the worldwide literature currently stands at, I think there's only sort of 230 cases have been documented in the worldwide academic literature about GRIN disorders. We know that the population within our community, or the people that we have access to, is probably closer to maybe 500 families around the world. And, that's just a virtue of the time lag between when these publications came out and where we are now. So, I have every expectation that in the next few years we're going to find a whole lot more people as well.
Absolutely, especially as genome sequencing becomes ubiquitous around the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the very exciting things for me to discover, I think, was that the gene panels that are being used to diagnose intellectual disability, particularly, and developmental delay, now include GRIN1.
Right.
So people are going to be found much more readily than they were before. And the same goes for epilepsy as well. That's now deemed to be related to that. So it's easier to be diagnosed, but it's still quite a long way off actually finding any treatment.
Right.
There's a lot of conversation between us as a community about the kind of problems that we have and what it would be nice to try and address. And schemes like Rare as One are going to help us formalise that a bit and actually start targeting some further investigations.
Right. So what are and I'm sure every person has a different set of priorities, but maybe from you personally or from the conversation of the group, is there some broad agreement around the first thing we need to do is X and the second thing is Y?
Yes, I probably should have done a bit more homework on this one, Patrick. Sorry. And apologies to Keith and Denise, who are leading the CureGRIN enterprise. Yes, there's sort of three main things that they're trying to achieve in the first few years. One is building up more of a community.
Right.
Two is finding a way of creating some kind of registry, or facilitating other people to create a registry, which will mean that the researchers are better able to understand what they're looking at. And thirdly, it's to work with people around the world who are already doing things like mouse modelling to find out whether there's lessons that they can teach us.
Is there much known about how closely the mouse kind of matches? Is it a useful model? Because in some conditions it is, but in others it's really not.
Well, when I first heard that there were mouse modelers interested in GRIN, I was quite surprised, I must confess. But I had a fascinating conversation with Amy Ramsey, who leads the lab in Toronto, which has been breeding GRIN1 mice for a while now, ostensibly in search of a treatment for Alzheimer's and other similar conditions. And she was quite surprised a couple of years ago to discover that there are humans who already have these GRIN disorders. And so I was desperate to find out about the characteristics of her mice, and she was quite keen to hear about our children, not surprisingly. But yeah, intellectual disability, epilepsy is very much on the cards. But she was also puzzled by some of their behaviours, and she was wondering whether the fact that her mice appeared not to have much grip strength was something that we have also. And I was able to say, well, our kids are able to hold on to things when they feel like it, but they just don't know why they would want to bother.
Motivation, yeah.
Totally. So maybe she'd like to go and investigate a bit more about the motivation of her mice. Great. So she was going to go and think about that a bit further. And similarly, there's a mouse test they do to find out how interested mice are in getting out of water onto a little island if you put them in a tank with an island on it. And all her GRIN mice were just lounging around in the water. And I said, well, I and a lot of other parents actually said, well, our kids love swimming too. That's something they would like. But the weirdest and most intriguing of all for me was I had to ask, so many of our children have very lustrous hair. So I said, is there anything unusual about these mice and their fur? Yeah. And she said, well, actually, there is. When we mutate these GRIN1 genes in the mice, they grow a dark stripe down their back. Really? And it goes away again when we fix them. And, that is something which clearly has no clinical utility, but it's obviously a thing that GRIN genes do. And that, for me, rang a massive bell about, well, what other things do they do that we don't know yet?
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose it's probably a fundamental gene. It almost certainly is a fundamental gene. So that usually means that it's present in other closely related organisms to us. So hopefully you can find some clues. In the podcast with Matt, I think I asked him towards the end of Matt might advice that he would have for patient organizations or researchers in ultra rare conditions. And he actually, it was surprising, but in retrospect, it makes complete sense. He said, don't worry so much about assembling all of these huge data sets and natural histories. He said, focus on finding a good model organism like a mouse, and screen for therapeutics that actually, the therapies can come from very surprising places. Often a drug that's already been approved somewhere else can work. So is that something that you all have been discussing as well? Yes,
absolutely. And people on the listening out there might have already heard about Helix have recently been looking for rare groups to work with. We're not sure yet whether we've been selected to work with them, but the kind of work that they're talking about doing using artificial intelligence to screen orphan drugs to find potential targets is something we'd be very excited about.
We actually we interviewed them for the podcast as well. They're, as of this recording, it hasn't been published yet, but I think it will be in the next week or two. So people will be able to, by the time this is out, people will have been able to hear about that.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I hope we'll be able to predict that we might be able to work with them.
I think these kind of approaches, maybe we'll know by then. I think these kind of approaches are great as well because they hopefully reduce the time to development of a new, if it takes 15 years, then the amount of money, and 15 years and the amount of money required means, unfortunately, that conditions that don't have thousands and thousands of patients, just the businesses can't justify to their business people why, you can justify to humans why it's important to do, but to business people it just doesn't make sense. But if you can use already approved drugs, do it in 4 years, then I think it opens up a huge realm of possibilities.
And that's very exciting. Yeah. Obviously, we love our kids to bits, but it would be great if they didn't find the things they find difficult, if they could find them less difficult, that would be fantastic.
In some of the information you sent me before, you laid it out in I think a really interesting way. You said that where we used to be in terms of patient involvement in research was all about awareness. Once we write something out, let's write it up in a way that everyone can understand, right? And where we are maybe now is moving towards collaboration. So things like what you just described, patient organizations or individual patients and researchers working together. You said that the future, though, is potentially patient-led research networks. Can you explain to me what you mean by that?
Well, I think there are now so many different ways of defining a rare condition. And so now we can see in such detail about what it is that's causing a problem. Inevitably, there aren't going to be enough researchers and doctors out there who are already going to be specialists in all of these to be able to immediately talk to us about what we can do. So I think it seems very important for us to try and coalesce around the condition that we're all affected by, and to jump up and down and make enough noise that we can attract enough attention of enough bright young things to come and help us, really. Yeah. And so by making ourselves as well organised as we can be and curating our data to an extent which makes us attractive for people to come and look at, then I think we're doing ourselves a favour there.
Do you suspect that this kind of patient-led research networks, what other downstream effects will that have on drug development or research more generally? Do you imagine a future where patient-led networks are funding PhD students and labs and maybe even whole clinical development programs for pharmaceutical companies? Is that kind of the way you imagine it? That
would be fantastic. I would imagine that the kind of conditions which are going to be able to harness enough funding to do that sort of thing are going to tend to be ones which are a bit more common than the ultra rarest. Right. But I think it depends how effective you are at fundraising and awareness raising to a great extent, because if people don't know you exist, then they can't offer you any funding. So that's a real job for the comms side of our organisation particularly, is to just get noticed, really.
Yes, and I suppose some of the initiatives like Chan Zuckerberg can help with that, but you also just have to I get the impression that you work very hard and you don't work 9 to 5. You're always working in a sense, because I know you're on numerous different leadership positions in large-scale organizations, but also day-to-day tweeting and raising awareness and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's true. And partly that's just the 21st century way of working, that you never completely switch off. But also, I think you do find that because it's something which drives you on a personal level, it's quite easy just to let that spill into every spare moment that you have. And I'm sure my mother would tell me I do too much of all this and I should just actually spend more time playing with my own child. But, it's very tempting to keep pushing on all the fronts that we can. And we haven't talked about this much yet, but certainly in terms of, being able to actually contribute to some of the conversations that are now happening at the level of information governance in Britain about what's happening more widely for rare disease patients, that feels like something really worthwhile to be doing. Right. And I think I'm very lucky to be in the position where I've got a bit of time to spend on this, and I'm very grateful that things seem to have gone as well as they have so far.
What other kinds of changes would you like to see? I mean, from my perspective, one of the big shifts in the last 5 years has been the now growing availability of genome sequencing as a diagnostic test, where I think getting a lot better, and hopefully we'll be a lot better at making that initial diagnosis. What other things do you think need to happen?
I think we're just beginning to realise, inevitably, as we all move through the process of having been part of the 100,000 Genomes project and now getting to a stage where people are getting results back from that in quite high volumes, I think we're just beginning to grapple with the problem that even if you have a diagnosis, it may be so ultra rare that there might not be anyone else in the country you share it with. So that ability to help people find people like themselves and to help researchers who've got the skills and the interest to do something about it is something that I think it's great to see. That I know that Baroness Blackwood recently acknowledged the importance of doing more to help people who are in the immediate post-diagnosis phase, and I think that's a real strength and something that we should really be focusing on.
Do you all use any of, because there are a number of there's software to create your own patient registry, there's patient social networks you can join. What occupies that space for you all, or is there something that doesn't exist that you feel like should exist in a way of connecting to the rest of the GRIN community? For example, do you all use a Facebook group, or do you use one of the patient social networks like Health Unlocked or Patients Like Me or one of the others? Okay,
yes. I think initially most of us found each other through Facebook.
Right.
And as time goes by, I think there are great strengths in that degree of visibility on the internet. But there's also an appetite for a space where you can meet online without necessarily being overheard by the world.
Absolutely.
So I think that's probably something that will be, I know it's something that CureGRIN are investigating in the next phase, with support from Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the other Rare as One partners, to think about how we go about creating an online tool resource where researchers and clinicians and patients can get together in a way which doesn't leave anybody exposed in a way they wouldn't want to be.
Yeah.
I know that there are some researchers, for example, who avoid being on Facebook, or if they are, they're under pseudonyms because they don't want people just sending them a barrage of questions all the time. And you have to respect that. And similarly, nobody necessarily wants to display themselves on the internet as somebody who's got a particular condition and is welcome to be approached by anybody who wants to talk about it.
Right, or
day or
advertisements.
Night. Absolutely. So I think, that social media has been a really useful tool to be able to find each other. But I think there is going to need to be an evolution beyond that. And I think, we're still quite a young organisation. So we're still exploring the options there.
And I think one of the other points that you kind of raised in your assessment of where we are today and where we're going is who has the power in the situation. And I know with Facebook specifically, there have been issues with, I think, breast cancer survivors group. There are a number of activists that have flagged up the way that ostensibly data people thought was private and part of a closed group was available due to issues with the way it was configured. I also understand that Facebook is trying to make some changes, so they're not sitting on their hands. In this particular case, I think they recognize the problem, but even if they create a space, for example, where people won't be targeted by ads, won't be heard, they still are the platform owner. So I wonder if you have any thoughts of how, maybe we're going to get a little bit philosophical here, but what do we need to do to shift that power?
That's a good question, because I think there's many of us, certainly those of us born before 1980, wouldn't have a clue about how to set up our own networks.
Right. And
so we're very happy to use a tool that's been generated by somebody else.
Right.
But we need to trust that we're not going to be disadvantaged by it.
Right. So you have to. So you I suppose don't see a problem with a platform as long as you can trust it, or or maybe it's something like, I know WhatsApp has its issues as well, and I think they're probably owned by Facebook, but things like Telegram, where the data is encrypted as it goes between people. Is it about, do you see it as a technological solution, or is it really more about a platform run by an organization that you can trust is maybe a better alternative?
That's a good question. I think there's quite a chunk of the people who have children with GRIN disorders probably don't mind who it is that they're using to talk to, what kind of platform it is, as long as they can have conversations which are relatively private, where they would like them to be, and enable them to reach as many people in the same boat as they are.
Right.
But there will be others who are very exercised about the privacy and the extent to which any of the information they share could be used for targeted adverts or whatever as well. So, or
insurance or what have you.
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose that's another thing, that we in Britain are shielded from the hard-nosed end of that, really, because of the National Health Service. And I suppose, I imagine that there's quite a lot of difference in North American healthcare that really does mean people have to be perhaps a bit more cautious about what they say about what's wrong with them, or about what they plan to do about that.
Yeah, and even there's insurance companies, there's law enforcement now. There are a lot of discussions around who has access to genetic databases, and there's also foreign government issues. So I know there's a number of research studies in the U.S. that won't allow non-U.S. technology providers to touch the data at all.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter what country you're from. If it's not the U.S., then you can't touch the health data. So I think we're transitioning maybe to there will be new challenges, right? If data can never leave the country, how do we do research that in rare disease requires international collaboration? Yes,
and that's definitely something which, I think Britain as a whole is grappling with, and as you mentioned, internationally it's a big challenge, because if we're going to move towards personalised medicine, the ability that we need is to be able to compare one patient in one country with a patient in another country. So you need to have that level of interoperability that means that people can be compared at an anonymous level for the benefit of actually how they're treated. But you don't want to put that in a form which is going to be too easy to access, or in some way could be used to disadvantage that individual. And so that constant tension between how robust your access controls are and how much use this information can be to anybody is something which I think we're all still grappling with, really, and it's definitely one of the big questions of our time.
Right, it's sort of fundamental, right? If you open access, then you increase the potential for it to be misused.
Yes.
But you also, if you close down access, then you limit the amount of science that can be done.
Absolutely.
So I suppose there is no answer, right? It depends on what a group of individuals thinks or the circumstances of a situation.
Yes, and I suppose that brings us neatly into something which was published in this country last year. There was a public conversation about what was an acceptable use of genetic data and genomic data. And Genomics England and Ipsos Mori did quite a lot of research together and published a very useful report that set out where, at the moment, the public's red lines are in terms of what's an acceptable use of health data and what is not. And I think that formed quite a useful framework for decision makers in this country, certainly, about the public appetite for, what they expect from the healthcare system and what they expect it not to do.
Were there surprises? I think we could probably predict some of it, but were there any surprising pieces from it?
I think it was interesting. There's, every study that ever seems to investigate this finds that there is generally quite a big appetite for people to let their data be used for the public good or for the good of other patients. Right. But I think then, depending on the communities that you're talking to, there's varying levels of suspicion about what else that data might be used for. Yeah,
one interesting thing that I've noticed as well is when you talk about use of data by commercial companies, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or big tech companies, often the way that it's pitched, people can be really sensitive if you phrase it as your data will be sold to pharmaceutical companies. Big red flags. But if you say your data will be accessed by pharmaceutical companies to develop new drugs, then people, both of those things are true, because many of the national scale genome institutes or genomics programs are in full or in part funded by pharmaceutical companies. Now, if we take UK Biobank, for example, the lion's share of the new whole genome and exome sequencing is funded by pharmaceutical companies, but ultimately for the benefit, ideally of developing new drugs. But where do people stand on that? It's a tricky issue, isn't it?
That is very interesting, and especially with the biobank, because everybody who's in it has consented to not be contacted about what happens next.
Yes, that's right, exactly.
So I bet there's quite a lot of people out there who are part of the biobank who would love to know a bit more about their own genomes, and I'm not party to any of the conversations about that, so I don't know what the plans are there, but I would imagine there'll be a certain requests coming in from quite a lot of people there to find out more.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on. What were you going to say?
That's another interesting question about who knows what about me compared to what I know about me.
Yeah.
And what is acceptable not to tell me about. Right. And what is it not acceptable not to tell me about. So, if, for example, if my genome has been sequenced, it's sitting there in the database, I'm waiting to find out whether any additional findings relating to me have been found or not. So whether I've got a predisposition to particular forms of cancer or conditions like familial hypercholesterolemia, which there are genetic markers for these. Yep. And so, I would love to know the answer to that question as far as they can tell me. But there's a lot of other things that my genome could probably also say about me, some of which I don't really want to know, because, with the best will in the world, you have to live in the here and now. Right. And sometimes knowing too much about what the future holds can actually be more damaging to your current mental health. Absolutely. And those kind of questions are ones which I think we do need to be continuing to involve members of the public and representative groups when we're discussing those. Right. Again, at national level, where we're talking about screening programs and that kind of thing, what is the common benchmark view, or what is people's view about how much they want to know and when? Right. Because sequencing is a phenomenally powerful technology, but it's only going to be useful if the information that it generates is given to the right people that need it at the right time.
And also giving mechanisms to recognize that people's choices change over time, right?
Yes.
And different people may, and I think the Alzheimer's disease risk is one of the classic examples, right? Where people can argue right past each other of why would you not want to know even if you can't do anything about it, or why would you want to know if you can't do anything about it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think those of us in the rare disease community might have a slightly different view from your average man in the street as well, because we have found that our children have these rare difficulties. And in our case, particularly, the first 3 months of my son's life was good, as far as I was concerned. We'd got the perfect family, 2 kids, 2 adults, all good. And that happiness that I felt then, I wouldn't want anyone to have taken it away from me if he'd been screened at 2 days old for something which I wasn't going to be able to do anything about at the time. Okay, if there's a treatment in future, maybe it's a different story, but to be told about something that you cannot change before it becomes apparent in the person you see before you is not necessarily a good idea, in my view.
Yeah, that's never quite thought of it that way, but it makes sense when you say it. It definitely makes sense. To wrap up here, I was wondering if one thing that I wanted to ask you, and I asked this to Matt Might, and because I got such an interesting answer from him, I thought it would be a question that when I speak to people like you all who've done some of these amazing things, it would be good to ask. So if you were to transport yourself back to the past to speak to yourself or speaking to a parent of a child with a rare disorder today that's looking to get more involved, to try to change the way things are done in the same way that you have, what would you suggest for them to focus or to prioritize, if they're starting out today?
Okay. Yep. Number 1 is find your tribe. Getting to be in touch with other families who are in the same boat is by far the most important thing that we've ever done, because if you're on your own, you're not going to manage to do anything. And even just finding somebody whose child is a bit like yours, when everybody else you see in the world isn't anything like yours, is so good. Unbelievably so. The power of being able to be in a room and see somebody who looks just like your kid, or who they've got a mannerism the same as your kid, and you can go, I'm not alone. This is connection here. That is really powerful. Yeah. So even from a mental health support perspective, beyond anything else, that's the first important thing, I think. And now that we have social media, it's much easier to do that than it used to be. Excellent. Secondly, I think being able to start defining what it is that you want to change. Right. That's something that CureGRIN have been quite good at so far. They've done quite a lot of thinking about where the priorities are, what it is that we would like to be different. We need to recognise that not everybody wants to necessarily cure their child. In many cases, we appreciate that that's not going to be realistic anyway, but there are still things we can do to make life less difficult for them. So by trying to identify which of them are the priorities, then we are making some progress. Right. And then I suppose being able to then find some funding to throw at that is the third stage. Again, CureGRIN has been very fortunate very quickly and has some great people on the board who know really how to do this kind of thing. And I suppose, in some ways it feels like a very beautiful coincidence that the people who've come together with children with GRIN disorders have a range of skills there, which are professional skills in networking and in organisational skills and in publicity and marketing and fundraising. You come from a town planning background, right? So, I think that that ability to look at something that's incredibly complex and distill something reasonable out of it, right? Is that the kind of core skill from town planning, or is it something else that... Well, there's not too much of an overlap really between town planning and healthcare. Yeah. I think more recently I was in the civil service in Britain, and the training I got there in terms of trying to develop new initiatives where the landscape was as yet not fully formed is something which has been much more useful, actually. Trying to define what your problem is initially and then conceptualize a solution to that has been, something that stood me in very good stead later. Yeah, I think that's just great advice generally. It's great advice for a parent that might be in your situation, but I think find a group of people that are passionate about the same things that you are, that you share something with, and clearly define a
problem that you want to solve or a vision for the future in some way, and then find a way to make it happen, whether it's funding or otherwise. That's great. I think, whether you're a parent of a child with a rare disease or a young person figuring out what you want to do with your life, or an old person figuring out what you want to do with your life, I think that's good advice.
And as someone who, we're in a 21st century office space today, which is full of millennials looking very groovy, and I feel very old as someone who was not born in 1980. But it's quite interesting to feel that, the journey that I've been on as a rare disease patient or parent, I feel like I'm never stopping learning.
Right.
And that's a great thing. You don't want to get to a point where you feel you know all there is to know, but certainly the last 5 years have just been an explosion of what, my horizons have broadened so far, and it's really exciting to see where we might go next.
Yeah, well, it's exciting. I think hopefully we can have you on in another, maybe in a year, once you're halfway through the network that you're part of now, and you've been able to build the foundation of the patient-led research network. We can check in and see where you all are.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.